The first thing Mark Riven heard that morning wasn't the dawn chorus of sparrows or the gentle hum of the valley waking up. It was the sharp, percussive crunch of gravel under heavy boots, followed by the low, official murmur of a police radio. He stood, knee-deep in the rich, loamy soil of his newest Zinfandel row, a trowel in his hand, and the warm, earthy scent of a coming harvest filling his lungs. The two deputies moving toward him through the morning mist looked out of place, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the gnarled, sleeping vines. "Mr. Riven?" the older one called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. His nameplate read, Higgins. He had the weary eyes of a man who'd seen too many domestic disputes and barking dog complaints. "We've had a complaint." Mark wiped a sweaty forearm across his brow, leaving a faint smear of dirt. "A complaint? About what? The sun coming up too loud?" Deputy Higgins didn't crack a smile. "Unpermitted agricultural activity. Violation of community bylaws. We need you to cease and desist all work immediately pending a hearing." Mark's laugh was a short, incredulous burst of air. He gestured with the trowel at the sprawling expanse around them. The vineyard rolled out in neat, soldier-straight rows down the gentle slope, the leaves a vibrant green against the russet soil. Beyond it, oak-dotted hillsides gave way to the deeper green of his redwood groves, all of it cradled by the silver ribbon of the river. "Unpermitted? Officer, this isn't a backyard tomato patch. This is my livelihood. This is the whole damn valley." The complainant, a Ms. Brenda Shrike of the Oak Creek Valley HOA, asserts this is common area land, the younger deputy said, reading from a tablet. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face still soft with inexperience. The name hit Mark like a physical blow. Brenda Shrike, the HOA president, the woman who had for the past 6 months been a constant low-grade nuisance, a mosquito buzzing at the edge of his peace. Notices about the unsightly woodpile near his barn. A warning about the excessive dust kicked up by his ancient, beloved tractor. A citation for the unauthorized historical plaque he'd erected for his great-great-grandfather, the man who'd first homesteaded this land. But this was different. This was in declaration of war. Common area? Mark's voice dropped, losing all its prior amusement. The morning chill started to seep through his work shirt. "Son, do you see any other houses? Any streetlights? Any sidewalks? You drove 5 miles on a private gravel road just to get to my gate." Deputy Higgins shifted his weight, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He looked uncomfortable, caught between procedure and the glaringly obvious truth. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job. The HOA has jurisdiction and they've filed a formal complaint. We have to respond. If you'll just come down to the station, we can sort this out." A cold fury began to replace Mark's initial shock. He thought of his grandfather teaching him how to prune a vine right here, his hands guiding Mark's small ones. He thought of his father's funeral, the wake held under the great oak by the house, the entire community he'd known his whole life sharing stories and wine from this very soil. This wasn't just property. It was his marrow. His bones were made of this valley's clay. "Officer," Mark said, his voice dangerously calm, "an HOA's power isn't magical. It derives from covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, that are attached to a property's deed. They only have authority over the properties whose deeds are subject to those rules. They can't just lay claim to land they don't own." Deputy Higgins blinked. The younger deputy stopped tapping on his tablet. It was then that a new sound joined the tableau. The aggressive purr of a well-tuned engine. A gleaming silver Lincoln Navigator crested the hill and rolled to a stop, its chrome gleaming arrogantly in the rising sun. The door opened, and Brenda Shrike emerged. She was a woman engineered for conflict, dressed in a khaki safari jacket and crisp slacks, as if she were on a colonial expedition to subdue a troublesome continent. Her blonde hair was helmet-perfect, not a strand disturbed by the gentle breeze that carried the scent of wild rosemary and damp earth. She held a leather-bound binder like a scepter. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice a clipped, efficient instrument, "I see you've located the violation." She didn't look at Mark. He was part of the landscape she was there to correct. "Ms. Shrike," Deputy Higgins said, with a nod that was neither respectful nor dismissive, merely professional. She finally turned her gaze to Mark. Her eyes, a pale, watery blue, scanned him from his muddy boots to his sweat-damp hair with unconcealed distaste. Mark, I see the notice was insufficient motivation. These plantings are in direct violation of Article 12, Section 4 of the Oak Creek Valley Covenants. No commercial agricultural enterprise shall be undertaken on any common area or lot without the express written approval of the Architectural Review Committee. Mark took a step forward, the rich soil clinging to his boots. The smell of her perfume, a cloying cloud of jasmine and vanilla, invaded the space, fighting with the natural aromas of his land. Brenda, this isn't a lot. This is a 5,000-acre ranch. My ranch. My name is on the deed. My family's name has been on it since 1882. What part of that are you not understanding? A tight, patronizing smile stretched her lips. The covenants apply to all properties within the designated Oak Creek Valley development. What development? Mark's voice began to rise, echoing off the hills. There is no development. There are 12 houses, Brenda. 12, all built in the 1990s on parcels my father sold. Your house is on one of them. This, he swept his arm in a wide, all-encompassing arc, is not one of them. This has never been part of any HOA. Her smile didn't falter. It was the expression of someone who had already won, who had the full weight of bylaws and boards and bureaucratic inertia on her side. She opened her binder. The map appended to the CC&Rs, recorded in the county clerk's office, clearly delineates the boundaries of the association. It includes this entire valley. She pointed a manicured finger at a highlighted section. On a photocopied map, it was indeed a rough circle that encompassed not just the 12 home sites, but the entire watershed, the forests, the vineyards, everything. Mark stared at the map, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. It was a forgery. It had to be. But it was a damn good one, complete with a faint county seal and a recorder's stamp. The sheer audacity of it took his breath away. This wasn't just petty tyranny anymore. This was a land grab. Where are you watching from? Comment your city right now, because what happened next proved that HOA power isn't just about ugly mailbox laws. It's a sickness that can spread anywhere. Deputy Higgins sighed, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Mr. Riven, if there's a dispute over the documentation, that's a civil matter for the courts. Our mandate is to keep the peace and enforce the law as it's presented to us. Right now, the presented law says you need to stop. He gestured to the young deputy. Start writing the citation. The younger deputy pulled out his ticket book. The sound of the pen clicking seemed obscenely loud. Brenda's smile widened, a predator savoring the moment before the kill. The fines for non-compliance are $500 a day, Mark. I'd suggest you put down the trowel. For a long moment, Mark was paralyzed. He saw it all unfolding with a terrible slow-motion clarity. The fines piling up, the liens placed on his property, the legal bills draining his accounts while his vines went untended. He could fight it in court, of course, but that would take months, years even. By the time he won, he'd have lost everything. This was her strategy, not to win in a fair fight, but to bury him in paper and legal fees until he simply gave up or went bankrupt. He looked from Brenda's triumphant face to the weary deputies, to the young one dutifully writing the ticket that would be the first nail in his coffin. The morning sun, once a comfort, now felt hot and accusing. The gentle rustle of the vine leaves sounded like a whisper of betrayal. Then, something in him broke, or perhaps something clicked into place. The part of him that wasn't just a vintner, but the son and grandson of men who had fought droughts, floods, and bank foreclosures to keep this land. The part that had, himself, spent 5 years as an Army JAG lawyer before coming home, navigating the complex minefields of military law. He'd left that world behind for a simpler life, but it seemed the world had followed him. He didn't look at the deputies. He didn't look at Brenda. He turned his back on them all and stared out at his valley, at the river catching the light, at the mist burning off the redwoods. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the truth of it. Deputy Higgins, he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying a new, steely authority that made the older lawman pause. Before you finish writing that ticket, there's something you need to see. And Ms. Shrike? He finally turned back to face her. The fear was gone, replaced by a glacial calm that made her smug smile finally flicker. "You might want to come take a look too. It's about those property lines you're so fond of." He didn't wait for a response. He just started walking toward his ranch house, a low-slung, sprawling building of stone and timber that had grown from a one-room homesteader's cabin. The footsteps behind him, curious, hesitant, official, followed. He led them through the rustic kitchen, past the giant oak table scarred with generations of use, the air smelling of coffee and last night's wood fire. He led them down a cool, dim hallway lined with black and white photos of stern men in overalls standing beside Model Ts, of women in aprons tending vast vegetable gardens. He stopped at a heavy oak door, unlocked it with a skeleton key from his pocket, and ushered them into his study. The room was a sanctuary of history and law. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound legal texts, historical county surveys, and decades of agricultural journals. A massive, scarred partner's desk dominated the center of the room. On the wall behind it, framed behind glass, was the prize of his collection: the original, hand-drawn survey map of the Riven Valley Grant, signed by a Mexican land commissioner. In 1843, Mark went straight to a large, flat drawer beneath the bookshelves. He pulled it open, the wood sliding smoothly on brass runners. The air that wafted out was old, carrying the scent of brittle paper and settled dust. Brenda stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her impatience a physical presence. "Really, Mark, this theatricality is beneath you. The deputies are busy. Men." "This'll just take a second," he said, his voice muffled as he sifted through large, flat documents. He pulled out a thick, ribbon-tied parchment bundle. Then another, and another. He carried them to the desk and began untying them, spreading them out under the warm glow of the green-shaded lamp. The deputies stood awkwardly near the door. Brenda took a step closer, her eyes narrowing at the archaic script and elaborate seals. "What is all this?" Deputy Higgins asked, his professional curiosity piqued. "This," Mark said, gently smoothing out the creases on the largest document, "is the story of this land. This one here is the original land grant. This is the deed from when my great-great-grandfather bought it after the American annexation. These are the parcel maps from every subdivision ever done on this property." His finger landed on a recent survey, done when his father was still alive. It was crisp and clear, every line, every benchmark precise. He looked straight at Brenda. "Your house, Ms. Shrike, is on parcel 12B. It is subject to the CC&Rs my father established for the Oak Creek Valley residential development." He tapped the map. "The boundary of that development is right here, a clear straight line." He then moved his finger a full 2 inches west on the large-scale map. "We are standing here, in the original Riven homestead, which has never ever been subdivided. It is a single contiguous parcel of land. It is not now, nor has it ever been, subject to any homeowners association." Brenda's face was pale. "That's impossible. The map filed with the county is a fraudulent amendment," Mark finished, his voice cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Someone took the original CC&R document, which only covered the 12 residential lots, and attached a forged exhibit, that map you showed the deputies, to extend the boundaries illegally. Probably recorded it during that big microfilm to digital conversion the county did a few years back, counting on the chaos to slip it through." "You see, deputies," Mark continued, his JAG training taking over, his words precise and devastating, "recording a forged document that purports to claim an interest in real property isn't just a civil matter, it's a criminal offense. Under Penal Code 115, filing a false document against real property is a felony. It carries a potential state prison sentence." The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the faint, nervous rustle of the young deputy's uniform as he shifted his weight. The smell of old paper and dust seemed to thicken, charged with the tension. Brenda Shrike's mouth opened, then closed. The absolute, unshakable certainty in her eyes crumbled, replaced by a dawning raw horror. She wasn't looking at a stubborn farmer anymore. She was looking at a lawyer who had just laid a perfect trap, and she had walked right into it, leading 2 officers of the law as her witnesses. Deputy Higgins let out a long, slow breath. He looked from the ancient, undeniable maps on the desk to the flimsy photocopy in Brenda's now trembling hand. He looked at Mark's calm, resolute face, and then at Brenda's mask of crumbling superiority. He reached out and gently took the ticket book from his young partner. He slowly, deliberately, tore the unfinished citation in half. "Ms. Shrike," Deputy Higgins said, his voice now holding a formal, grave tone. "I think you need to come down to the station with us. We need to have a very long talk about this map of yours." The color drained completely from Brenda's face. The leather binder slipped from her fingers and hit the Persian rug with a soft, final thud. Mark Riven stood behind his desk, the rightful king of his valley, and watched as the queen of her petty, imagined empire began to fall. And he knew, with a cold certainty, that the war for his home was only just beginning. She had powerful friends, she had a board behind her, and a cornered animal, especially one like Brenda Shrike, was at its most dangerous. He had won the first battle. But the shock on her face was already curdling into something else, something venomous and promised retribution. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The silence in the study after the deputies led a pale, trembling Brenda Shrike away was louder than any argument. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from the room, leaving only the scent of old parchment and the faint, acrid trace of her jasmine perfume. Mark Riven stood motionless behind his desk, his fingers resting on the cool, smooth surface of the 1843 land grant. The victory felt hollow, brittle. He had not missed the look in Brenda's eyes as she was escorted out. Not just fear, but a searing, promises-made hatred. This wasn't a checkmate. It was the end of the opening gambit, and his opponent had just revealed she played for keeps. The phone rang an hour later, shattering the fragile peace. It wasn't the sheriff's office. It was Old Man Hemlock, his voice a reedy tremor of panic over the crackling line. "Mark, they're here, some fellas in a truck. They're saying I gotta take down my B-boxes, saying they're an attractive nuisance and a non-conforming use. They're talking about fines, big ones." Mark's gut tightened. Eli Hemlock was 82. He lived in the original caretaker's cottage on what was now Parcel 7, a man who knew more about the secret rhythms of the valley than anyone alive. His honey, from bees that pollinated the wild manzanita and apple trees, was a local legend. And he was kind. The kind of man who left jars of it on porches for sick neighbors. "Who's there, Eli?" "Don't know him. Not from around here. Got mean eyes. One of 'em's taking pictures." Mark was in his truck, kicking up a plume of dust on the gravel road, within minutes. The scene at Eli's was a study in petty brutality. A shiny new Ford F-150, black and imposing, was parked on the wildflower verge Eli had nurtured for decades. Two men in matching polo shirts embroidered with a logo, a stylized eagle and the words, "Community Standards Enforcement," stood with their arms crossed. One held a digital camera, systematically photographing the 12 painted beehives that sat in a sunny patch of Eli's garden. The air, usually sweet with the smell of lavender and buzzing with industry, was tense and silent. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Mark's voice was deceptively calm. He got out of his truck, the doors slammed like a punctuation mark. The larger of the two men turned. He had a shaved head and a neck that bulged over his collar. "Enforcing a violation notice. Unapproved. Structures. Potential biohazard." "This is private property," Mark said, walking slowly toward them. He could smell Eli's anxiety from the porch, a sour note mingling with the sweet pollen. "Subject to Oak Creek Valley HOA jurisdiction," the man recited, his eyes devoid of warmth. He handed Mark a crisp sheet of paper. It was an official notice of violation, issued by the HOA's Compliance Committee. The fine listed was $1,000, with an additional $500 per day until the violation was remedied. Mark didn't look at the paper. He looked at the man's truck, at the logo, at the cold efficiency of the operation. Brenda was in custody, but her machine was still running. She had outsourced her malice. "You need to leave," Mark said, his voice low. "We'll leave when we've completed our documentation," the other man said, snapping another photo of a terrified honeybee on a coneflower. Mark took a step closer, invading their personal space. The smell of their cheap cologne was an assault. "You should know that trespassing in California isn't just a matter of a no trespassing sign. Under Penal Code 602, entering someone's property after being asked to leave, or for the purpose of interfering with their business, is a misdemeanor. You're not law enforcement, you're private citizens, and you are now unwelcome. He pulled his phone from his pocket. I'm calling Sheriff Higgins. I'm sure he'd be very interested in why you're harassing an elderly man on behalf of an HOA president who was just arrested for filing a fraudulent document with the county. The two men exchanged a glance. The script they'd been given hadn't included this. The bald one's jaw worked. We're just doing our job. Your job is over, Mark said, his thumb hovering over the call button. Get in your truck. Get off this man's land. Don't come back. There was a long, tense moment. A bee landed on Mark's sleeve, oblivious to the human drama. Finally, the bald man nodded curtly. They got in their truck, executed a clumsy three-point turn, and rumbled back down the road. Eli emerged from his porch, his face etched with relief and a new, deep worry. They'll be back, won't they, Mark? Yeah. Eli, Mark said, watching the dust settle. They'll be back. The retaliation was not a single blow, but a death by 1,000 paper cuts. It began the next morning. A certified letter arrived for the Williams family, 3 parcels over. Their 16-year-old son, Cody, had a beat-up Toyota pickup he was restoring. The letter stated that unregistered or inoperable vehicles were a violation of community standards. It had to be removed or rendered visually neutral within 48 hours, or they would face daily fines. The truck was parked in their own driveway, behind their house, visible to no one but the birds and the occasional deer. Another letter went to the Garcias. Their crime? Their roof, damaged in a winter storm, had been temporarily patched with a blue tarpaulin until the roofing company could schedule the repair. The HOA's Architectural Review Committee deemed the blue tarp aesthetically non-compliant. They were ordered to replace it with a brown or gray tarp immediately. The notice arrived on a Friday afternoon. The roofing supply stores were closed until Monday. Then came the water. Mark found the notice nailed to the ancient oak next to the valve station for his agricultural irrigation line. It was an official-looking document from the fictional Oak, Creek Valley Water District, citing him for unauthorized diversion of riparian resources and ordering an immediate cessation of all watering pending a review. It was pure nonsense, a complete misunderstanding, or a malicious fabrication of California water law. But the threat was real. His vines, just entering the critical veraison period, where the grapes soften and sweeten, needed water. Without it, the entire year's crop and the millions of dollars of wine aging in his barrels from previous years would be jeopardized. Where are you watching from? Has your HOA ever invented rules out of thin air just to hurt you? Comment below. This is how they operate. He spent the day on the phone. His lawyer, a sharp, pragmatic woman named Lena Petrova in Sacramento, listened patiently to the escalating insanity. They're testing you, Mark, she said, the sound of her keyboard clicking in the background. They're seeing how far they can push, how much it will cost you to fight, how many fronts they can open. It's a classic strategy. Bleed the opponent dry. They're going after my water, Lena. They're going after my neighbors. They're using some kind of private enforcement goon squad. The private enforcement is interesting, Lena mused, and illegal, if they're trespassing. But the fines, that's their weapon. They'll lien the properties for unpaid fines. They'll foreclose on properties they don't even have jurisdiction over. Mark exploded, pacing in his study. The familiar smell of old books and wood polish usually calmed him. Now it felt like the walls of a siege tower. Jurisdiction is a legal argument, Mark. Foreclosure is a financial reality. They can file the paperwork. It would be fraudulent, but it would still tie up your title, scare your bank, and cost you a fortune in legal fees to clear. That's the point. They don't need to win in court. They just need to make the fight so expensive you surrender. The truth of it settled over him like a lead weight. He was a farmer, a winemaker. Even with his legal background, he was one man against an organization with a seemingly endless budget for harassment and a blatant disregard for the law. The feeling of impotent rage was a poison in his blood. He decided to take the fight to them. The next HOA meeting was that Tuesday evening. He would go. He would stand before the entire board and present his evidence. He would appeal to reason, to decency. Surely not everyone in this group was a monster. Surely some of them would see The insanity. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland prefabricated building that smelled of chlorine from the adjacent pool and stale coffee. The air was artificially cold, humming with the effort of the AC unit. Mark took a seat in the back row of plastic chairs, observing the scene. It was a perfect tableau of suburban micro-fascism. The board members sat at a long table at the front, nameplates before them. Brenda Shrike's seat was empty, a glaring absence. In her place sat a man named Carl Jepson, a retired insurance adjuster with a comb-over and a perpetually sour expression. He wielded the gavel with an unearned gravitas. The meeting was a parade of the profoundly petty, a 15-minute debate over the approved shade of beige for garage doors, a solemn discussion about a homeowner who had flown a University of Oregon flag on game day, violating the one permanent flagpole, one American flag bylaw. A woman was nearly in tears as she was lectured about the weed infestation, a patch of clover, in her lawn. Mark waited, his patience thinning with each passing minute of absurdity. Finally, during new business, he stood up. "Mr. Jepson, my name is Mark Riven. I'd like to speak." Every head in the room turned. A silence fell, heavier than the previous ones. They knew who he was. He was the enemy. Jepson adjusted his glasses. "The public comment period is at the end of the meeting, Mr. Riven. You'll have to wait your turn." "This isn't a comment. This is a fact. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property, or over the properties of Eli Hemlock, the Williamses, or the Garcias. The map you are using to claim authority is a forgery. Your president is under investigation for filing it. Any fines you have issued are fraudulent. Any further harassment will be met with not just civil lawsuits, but criminal complaints for trespassing, extortion, and conspiracy." The room was dead quiet. You could hear the faint gurgle of the coffee maker in the corner. Jepson's face flushed a mottled red. "Those are serious accusations." "They're backed by serious evidence," Mark said, holding up a folder. "I have the original parcel maps. I have the legally recorded CC&Rs that apply only to the 12 residential lots in this development. I suggest you consult your own attorney before this goes any further. Call off your dogs. This ends now." For a moment he thought he saw a flicker of doubt in Jepson's eyes, a glimmer of fear in the faces of a few other board members. Maybe the bluff would work. Then a voice cut through the tension from the side of the room. "Your evidence is irrelevant, Mr. Riven." A man stood up from a chair against the wall, where he'd been observing quietly. He was in his late 50s, with silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that cost more than Mark's tractor. He had the relaxed, predatory confidence of a man who was used to owning every room he walked into. He didn't need a nameplate. Mark knew him. Everyone did. Robert Thorne, the most powerful real estate developer in 3 counties. The man who had, years ago, first approached Mark's father about buying the entire valley. The man who had been politely but firmly refused. Thorne smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "The jurisdiction of the Oak Creek Valley Homeowners Association is established and recognized. Your historical documents are a charming curiosity. But the matter of the fines is quite simple. They have been assessed. They are due. Failure to pay will result in liens being placed on the properties in question." He took a few steps toward the center of the room. "This isn't a personal vendetta, Mark. May I call you Mark? This is about preserving property values, maintaining standards. Your vineyard, your agricultural operation, it's an anachronism. It creates dust. It uses a tremendous amount of water. It attracts transients during harvest. It's not what we envision for this valley." The pieces snapped together in Mark's mind with an almost audible click. This was never about Brenda Shrike's petty power trip. She was just a useful idiot, a front. This was about Thorne. He had wanted this valley for decades. He couldn't buy it, so he was trying to steal it. He was using the HOA, an organization he likely controlled from the shadows, to fabricate millions of dollars in fines, lien the properties, and then swoop in to foreclose on the entire valley for pennies. On the dollar. He would turn it into a gated community of McMansions, golf courses, and strip malls. He would erase a century and a half of history for profit. Mark's voice was cold steel. "What I envision for this valley, Mr. Thorne, is protected by more than old maps. Water rights in California are based on a system of first in time, first in right. My family's riparian rights to that river predate the state itself. You can't just take them because you find them inconvenient. And using a sham organization to file fraudulent liens. That's not just a civil matter. That's racketeering. RICO statutes carry 20-year sentences. Thorne's smile didn't falter, but it became colder, more fixed. The room was frozen, the homeowners watching this duel like spectators at a tennis match. You have a lively imagination, Thorne said smoothly. I'd be careful about making slanderous accusations in a public forum. The courts are the proper place to settle disputes over fines and bylaws. I suggest you save your arguments for there. He turned to Jepson. I move we table this discussion and proceed with the agenda. Jepson, grateful for the command, slammed the gavel. So moved. Mr. Riven, you are out of order. Mark stood there, isolated in the chill air of the room. He had walked in thinking he was facing a neighborhood bully. He was facing a corporate shark with billions of dollars and a bottomless appetite for legal warfare. Thorne had just made the rules of engagement brutally clear. This would be fought in court, a battle of attrition where the side with the deepest pockets always wins. He drove home through the darkness, the lights of the clubhouse fading in his rearview mirror. The headlights cut a lonely path through the night, illuminating the gnarled vines that were now under a threat far greater than any pest or drought. The weight of it was crushing. He couldn't outspend Robert Thorne. He couldn't outlawyer him. He pulled up to his house and killed the engine. The silence of the valley was profound, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. He got out and stood there, under a blanket of stars his ancestors had also seen, and felt a despair so deep it was a physical ache. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Deputy Higgins. Mark. Brenda Shrike was released an hour ago. No charges. DA called it a civil dispute. She's home. The message was followed a second later by another. And Mark, watch your back. The screen went dark. The night felt suddenly menacing. The familiar sounds of the valley, the crickets, the wind in the trees, now sounded like whispers of a coming threat. They had the system, the money, and now the impunity. He was alone. He walked into his dark, silent house, the battle lost before it had even truly begun. The war for his home had just escalated from a border skirmish to a fight for its very soul, and he had no army, no weapons, and no hope. He was wrong. The next morning, as a bruised dawn broke over the hills, he found it, tucked into the frame of his front door, not in an envelope, just a folded square of paper. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, precise, and anonymous. Thorne doesn't own the water. The county does. Look at the easement for the old diversion. Dam. Parcel 19. He needs it for his project. It's the key. He stared at the note, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't alone. Someone on the inside was fighting back. The game had just changed. The note in his hand felt like a live wire humming with dangerous potential. The paper was cheap, unlined, the kind bought in bulk for office printers. The handwriting was all block capitals, a deliberate disguise that gave nothing away. But the words were a map to the heart of the beast. Thorne doesn't own the water. The county does. Look at the easement for the old diversion dam. Parcel 19. He needs it for his project. It's the key. Mark stood frozen on his porch, the cool morning air sharp in his lungs, carrying the scent of dew-damp earth and the distant, yeasty perfume of fermenting grapes from his cellar. The despair of last night, thick and suffocating, as a blanket, began to tear. This wasn't hope. Hope was too fragile a thing for a fight like this. This was intelligence, a crack in the enemy's armor. Parcel 19. The old diversion dam. It was a crumbling relic of concrete and rusted steel, built by his grandfather in the 1940s to channel water for the first major planting of vines. It had been mostly dormant for years, replaced by a modern pumping station further downriver. But an easement, a legal right for the county to access or use that land, that was a thread. And if Robert Thorne needed it for his development, that thread could be pulled. He spent the day buried not in the earth, but in the past. The musty, comforting smell of his study became his world. He pulled every file, every deed, every survey that mentioned Parcel 19 or the diversion dam. The answer wasn't in the thick formal deeds. It was tucked into a faded manila folder labeled County Correspondence, 1972. A single typed letter on brittle yellow paper from the County Water Resources Department. It thanked his grandfather for granting a perpetual access easement for county hydrologists to inspect the dam and its water levels, a condition for some long-forgotten grant money. The easement was real. It was county property. And it sat, a sovereign piece of government interest, right in the middle of what Thorne undoubtedly considered his future domain. Mark's mind, trained to see legal patterns, began to connect the dots. An easement isn't just a right of way, he muttered to the silent, book-lined room. It's a cloud on the title. For a developer like Thorne, it's a nightmare. You can't subdivide. You can't build foundations. You can't get clean title insurance if a government agency has the right to tromp through someone's backyard with surveying equipment whenever they want. He doesn't just need the land. He needs the easement extinguished. And to do that, he needs the county to give it up. And how does a powerful man convince a county government to surrender a valuable property right? Not with a request, with pressure, with a show of force. By demonstrating absolute, uncontested control over the entire valley. By making the HOA's jurisdiction seem like a fait accompli. The forged map, the bullying fines, the liens, it was all a massive theater production staged for one audience, the County Board of Supervisors. Thorne was creating facts on the ground, proving he already owned the place in everything but name, so the county would see the easement as a pointless technicality and sign it away. The HOA war was a distraction. The water was the prize. He called Lena Petrova, his voice crackling with renewed energy. He laid it out, the easement, the dam, Thorne's likely play. Lena whistled softly. That's it. That's the leverage. He can't have a county easement sitting inside his shiny new development. It spooks the bondholders and the buyers. Mark, you don't need to beat him in a straight fight. You just need to make holding that easement more valuable to the county than giving it up. How? Mark asked, the immensity of fighting City Hall looming before him. You make a stink, Lena said simply. A big, loud, public stink. You make the easement the most famous piece of dirt in the county. You turn it into a symbol. You give the local news a story they can't resist. Local farmer fights billionaire's water grab. Thorne relies on everything happening in quiet, wood-paneled rooms. You have to blow the doors off those rooms. The strategy was clear, but it felt overwhelming. He was one man. Then he remembered the Williamses' truck, the Garcia's tarp, old Eli Hemlock's terrified bees. He wasn't one man. He had an army. They were just scared, disorganized, and leaderless. He spent the afternoon going door to door, not with legal folders, but with a simple message. He stood on porches, in driveways, smelling of fresh coffee and shared anxiety. He looked the Williams family in the eye and told them their son's truck was a symbol of freedom. He stood with Mr. Garcia on his roof, the blue tarp snapping in, the wind like a rebel flag, and told him it was a banner of defiance. He sat at Eli's kitchen table, the sweet smell of honey cutting through the fear, and told him his bees were the sound of resistance. He called a meeting at his house that evening. They came, all of them, cramming into his big kitchen, their faces etched with worry and a fragile new determination. The air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat and the rich stew Mark had put on the stove. He stood before them, not as a lawyer or a landowner, but as a neighbor. They're not picking us off one by one because we're weak, he said, his voice steady. They're doing it because they know that together we're strong. Thorne doesn't want your houses. He wants the water under them. He wants to pave this whole valley and sell it off in pieces, and he's using Brenda Shrike and that HOA board as his hired muscle to make it happen. He saw the understanding dawn on their faces, the anger pushing out the fear. It was one thing to be fined for a messy yard. It was another to have your entire way of life targeted for extinction. The county board meeting is next Monday, Mark announced. They're voting on a routine matter, a request to extinguish an old easement on my land. They think it's nothing. They think no one will care. We're going to show them they're wrong. Every single one of us is going to be there. We're going to tell our stories. We're going to show them what this valley really is. The plan was born in that warm, crowded kitchen. Cody Williams, a whiz with a drone, would get aerial footage of the entire valley, contrasting its natural beauty with mock-ups of Thorne's proposed development. Mrs. Garcia, who worked at the local paper, knew every reporter by name. Eli Hemlock would bring jars of his honey, a tangible, sweet product of the land they were fighting for. If you believe your community is worth fighting for, type "We stand" in the comments. Let's show them what happens when they push too far. The following week was a whirlwind. Mark and Lena worked around the clock preparing his presentation for the board. It wasn't just a legal argument, it was a story of history, of family, of a sustainable agricultural business that fed the local economy versus a billionaire's greedy land grab. They filed formal objections with the county, peppering the process with enough legal hurdles to slow down the rubber stamp approval Thorne undoubtedly expected. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and drizzly, the sky a low, oppressive ceiling. The county administration building smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and stale anxiety. The hearing room was a temple of bureaucracy. Fluorescent lights, worn carpet, a long dais for the 5 county supervisors. On one side of the room sat Robert Thorne and a phalanx of expensive lawyers in suits that whispered of $1,000 haircuts. They smelled of minty breath and arrogance. Brenda Shrike sat behind them, her usual smugness replaced by a pinched, nervous energy. On the other side, Mark Riven stood with his neighbors. They were farmers in clean flannel, mechanics in their best jeans, elderly folks holding jars of honey. They didn't look like much, but they filled the room with a quiet, solid presence. The air around them hummed with a different frequency, of determination, of shared history, of right. The chairman introduced the item. Request to extinguish hydrologic access easement, E-1984, Parcel 19, Riven Valley. Thorne's lead attorney stood, smooth and condescending. He spoke of streamlining governance, removing obsolete encumbrances, and paving the way for future economic development that would benefit the entire county. He presented charts and graphs showing projected tax revenue. It was cold, logical, and utterly soulless. Then it was Mark's turn. He walked to the podium, a simple wooden stand that felt like the prow of a ship. He plugged a thumb drive into the AV system. "Mr. Chairman, members of the board," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the tense room. "My name is Mark Riven. My family has owned and worked the land you're discussing for over 140 years. This isn't about an obsolete encumbrance. This is about a billionaire attempt to steal a valley, and he's using a fraudulent homeowners association as his weapon." He clicked the remote. Cody's drone footage filled the screen behind him, sweeping, glorious shots of the vineyard. In the morning mist, the river cutting through the redwoods, Eli's bees pollinating apple blossoms. Then, it cut to the notices. The fines. The photo of the 2 enforcement thugs at Eli's house. He read the violation letters aloud, each petty accusation sounding more absurd in the formal setting of the county chamber. He then turned to the law. The Oak Creek Valley HOA has no legal standing to issue these fines or claim this jurisdiction. The map they are using is a demonstrable forgery, a fact the sheriff's department can confirm. This entire campaign of harassment is a criminal enterprise designed for one purpose: to create a false narrative of control so that Mr. Thorne can secure the one thing standing between him and his tract houses, this county easement. He turned to face Thorne directly. The developer's face was a mask of cold fury. "You don't want to extinguish this easement for the county's benefit. You want it extinguished for yours, because without it, your title is clouded, your investors get nervous, your house of cards falls down." The room was silent. You could hear the hum of the lights, the soft patter of rain against the windows. Then, Mark did the last thing anyone expected. He didn't ask the board to preserve the easement. He asked them to use it. "I am formally inviting the County Water Resources Department to activate its right of access," he declared. "I want hydrologists on that dam next week. I want them taking measurements. I want them to produce a public report on the health of our watershed. Because I'll tell you what this is really about. It's not about a forgotten easement. It's about a permanent, sustainable water source that my family has protected for generations. A source that a massive development would inevitably pollute and deplete. This easement isn't obsolete. It's the most important tool you have to protect this county's resources from a short-sighted water grab." It was a masterstroke. Lena had devised it. He wasn't defending. He was inviting. He was turning Thorne's own weapon against him. The county wouldn't be giving up a useless right. They'd be abandoning their duty to protect a vital resource. The public comment period began. One by one, Mark's neighbors stood up. Eli Hemlock, his voice trembling but clear, talked about his bees and the clean water they depended on. Mr. Williams talked about the dust from a construction site that would coat his son's lungs. Mrs. Garcia talked about the traffic, the noise, the loss of a community. They were simple, powerful stories. They were the truth. The supervisors listened, their professional masks slipping to reveal real interest, and then real concern. Thorne's lawyer stood for a rebuttal, flustered and angry, accusing Mark of theatrics and conspiracy theories. But the spell was broken. The cold financial argument had been drowned out by the warm, human one. The chairman called for a vote. All in favor of the request to extinguish easement E 1984? 2 hands went up. Thorne had clearly done his homework and bought 2 votes. Opposed? 3 hands went up. The request was denied. The gavel slammed down. The sound was like a cannon shot of justice. On his side of the room, there was a collective gasp, then a wave of relieved, tearful cheers. The smell of triumph was sweet and electric. On Thorne's side, there was only cold, silent rage. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and without a word, turned and walked out, his lawyers scrambling. Behind him, Brenda Shrike looked lost, a puppet whose strings had just been cut. But Mark wasn't done. As the room began to clear, he walked over to Deputy Higgins, who had been observing from the back of the room. He handed him a file. "This is a sworn affidavit," Mark said, his voice loud enough for the remaining reporters to hear. "It details the conspiracy to file fraudulent documents, commit trespassing, and attempt extortion. The ringleader is Robert Thorne. The accomplice is Brenda Shrike. The attempted theft of this valley is worth millions. I believe that meets the threshold for a felony investigation." Higgins took the file, a grim smile on his face. He nodded to another deputy. They walked over to where Brenda Shrike was still sitting, stunned and alone. "Brenda Shrike," Higgins said, his voice formal and clear. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and filing a false document. You have the right to remain silent." The look on her face, pure, unadulterated terror, was the final, satisfying punctuation mark. She was read her rights and led away, this time for good. The victory was total. The war was over. Weeks later, the first autumn chill was in the air, carrying the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The last of the grapes had been harvested. The valley was settling into its winter sleep, safe. Mark Riven stood once more in the soil of his vineyard, not with a trowel, but with a glass of his own Zinfandel, deep and red as blood. He looked out at his land, at the hills his family had loved and fought for. The silence was no longer menacing. It was peace. Robert Thorne was under investigation by the state attorney general. The Oak Creek Valley HOA had been dissolved by a unanimous vote of the actual homeowners once they saw the corruption at its core. The forged map had been expunged from the county records. He had done more than save his property. He had saved a legacy. He had proven that even against impossible odds, a single person, backed by a community and armed with the truth, could slay a giant. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere down the road, he could hear the happy, sputtering sound of Cody Williams's truck engine finally turning over. The sound wasn't a violation. It was the sound of freedom. He took a sip of his wine, the complex flavors of oak, dark fruit, and the very earth he stood on bursting on his tongue. It tasted like victory. It tasted like home. Your story could be next. If you're fighting a powerful bully, remember this: know your rights, find your allies, and never, ever give up. They want you to think you're alone. You're not. Comment your biggest takeaway from this takedown below, and if you believe in justice, hit subscribe. Our community is just getting started.